Hello. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Oh, that's a lot. All right, so welcome to UC Center Sacramento. We're so pleased to have you here as part of our UC Center Sacramento Capital Insights program. My name is Cindy Simmons, and I'm the Associate Director for UC Center Sacramento. This event is being co-sponsored by UC Center Sacramento and the UC Consortium on the Developmental Science of Adolescence. We've been working with UC Davis professor Paul Hastings and his consortium on hosting several talks this year related to the developmental science of youth. Professor Hastings is a professor of psychology at the University of California, Davis, and he is a member of the core faculty of the Health, Emotions, Relationships, and Development Lab. He examines the contributions of nurture through children's close relationships with family and friends, and nature through autonomic and neuroendocrine regulatory systems. Professor Hastings is here today to tell you a bit more about the work of the UC Consortium on the developmental science of adolescence and introduce our panel who will be talking today on immigrant youth facing challenges, how developmental science can guide policy making in California. So please join me in welcoming Professor Hastings.
Thank you, Cindy, and thank all of you for coming. We're really excited to see such a great attendance for this event. I'm not going to talk for long because I really know you didn't come here to hear me, and our speakers have a lot of exciting information to share with you. But I wanted to tell you a little bit about the UC Consortium on the Developmental Science of Adolescence. This is a group of faculty at 5 of the UC campuses, Berkeley, Davis, Irvine, Los Angeles, and Santa Cruz, in psychology, education, public health, and affiliated departments, who have been receiving support from the UC Office of the President for the past 6 years to be bringing together our expertise from across disciplines, across disciplinary approaches, and across the campuses in order to create new understanding, new perspectives, and new training opportunities for advancing the study of adolescent development. And the faculty together collectively are approximately 35 faculty with roughly 80 master's and doctoral trainee students involved in our work. And the work is extending across all aspects of development. That will be reflected in today's session on immigrant youth facing challenges, in that the 3 faculty who are going to be speaking with you today are all trained in psychology, but all in very different facets of psychology, and they work in different fields, touching on neuroscience, public health, education, and other aspects of work. So we're going to be hearing today from Dr. Jennifer Silvers, an assistant professor at UCLA, Dr. Juliana Deerdorf, an associate professor at UC Berkeley, and I should say Dr. Silvers is in psychology at UCLA, and Dr. Deerdorf is in public health at UC Berkeley, and Dr. Jana Juvonen, who is in psychology at UCLA. And these 3 faculty have been members of the consortium since its founding, and have been very key players in both advancing the mission of the consortium and in really facilitating the training of the students. All 3 of them bring their different expertises to the study of immigrant youth, including, of course, Mexican origin and other Latinx youth in California, but also immigrant youth and youth of immigrant families from other immigrant communities within California as well. So I think that's as much time as I will take for this, and I will welcome Dr. Silvers up to the stage to give us our first talk.
Great. Just bring this down a notch. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. So as a developmental neuroscientist and the parent of 2 children under the age of 3, I spend pretty much every waking moment of my life thinking about the needs of children. That's literally all I do, 0 hobbies. The good news for me is that kids are actually remarkably straightforward. If we were to think about what are the ingredients that comprise a healthy child, they roughly consist of access to food, shelter, educational opportunities, and most importantly, from my perspective, not only because I'm a mom, but really because of my research, parenting. specifically quality and consistent parenting. So, when we think about these ingredients that give rise to healthy children, childhood adversity stands in stark contrast to them. And I'm going to throw up a scientific definition of childhood adversity here. It's a bit of a mouthful, but I'm going to walk you through the parts that I think are most essential. So, childhood adversity can be described as circumstances that are likely to require significant psychological, social, or neurobiological adaptation by an average child, and that represent a deviation from the expectable environment. And I promise that is the most complex thing I'm going to put up in this entire presentation. But I want to unpack a few key aspects of this definition. The first is that when we think about adversity, we're not just talking about a child facing challenge. We're talking about something that requires them to adapt their approach significantly. So we're not talking about something like transitioning to a new school or welcoming a new sibling or getting in an argument with a peer. This is something much more significant in a child's life. The second part of this definition I want to touch on is expectable environment. Human children come into this world with a few expectations. Basically, that the needs I described on the prior slide are going to be met. They don't really care what kind of food they're going to be fed, if it is Chinese or French or something in between, but they expect to be fed. They don't care if they're going to be taught Mandarin or if they're going to be taught Spanish, but they expect to be exposed to some kind of language. That's what I mean by an expectable environment. And childhood adversity represents a deviation from those basic needs being met. Some of the most common threats to a child having those needs met or common forms of adversity include poverty, exposure to violence, neglect, being separated from one's family, or being placed in institutional care, so meaning orphanage care or an other kind of institutional setting. So why does childhood adversity matter so much? It's not merely that it's unpleasant for children. It actually can be extremely dangerous to their health and well-being. 45% of child mental health problems can be attributed to childhood adversity. And what's perhaps more troubling is the fact that 30% of adult mental health problems can be attributed to childhood adversity, making it the single biggest preventable contributor to mental health problems that we know of. And I think the fact that we see this persisting into adulthood really speaks to the lasting impact that childhood adversity can have on a person's well-being. And although today I'm going to be focusing primarily on mental health, I would be remiss to not mention, at least briefly, that the impact of childhood adversity extends into the physical health domain as well, with roughly 20% of the world's cardiovascular disease cases also being attributed to childhood adversity exposure. So this is a significant concern that we really need to take seriously. And you might be asking at this point, you didn't come here to hear a talk on childhood adversity. What does this have to do with immigrant youth? The reason this is so relevant is that immigrant youth are at particularly high risk for exposure to adversity for really multiple reasons. First off, they're likely, or there's a very good chance that they experienced adversity in their country of origin. This is one of the biggest reasons that folks report their reason for coming to the United States is to escape poverty or violence. In fact, one recent report indicated that over 15% of Latina and Latino immigrants in this country report having experienced trauma in their home country. It doesn't necessarily get better as they journey to the United States. For many folks, this can be a time of great danger as well. And one danger that comes on top of the ones I've already described includes the potential for family separation. We're seeing an unprecedented rise in unaccompanied minors entering the United States, where they are coming in without their parents, or they are being separated from their families upon entry. And this is something that's received quite a bit of attention just in the last couple years, with families sometimes being detained at the border, separated, and children at times being placed in institutional settings, which can have even greater consequences for their health and well-being. For children who do remain with their parents, this concern about being separated continues, particularly for those who have parents who are undocumented. This is one of the biggest concerns children report who have undocumented parents, is that their parents could be deported and thus taken away from them, which is part of the reason that we see incredibly high rates of anxiety and depression among youth who have parents who are undocumented. So we see this kind of amalgamation of potential risk factors that increase the likelihood of immigrant youth being exposed to adversity. And this matters quite a bit because while any adversity exposure in childhood has the potential to be problematic, Over and over again, research shows us that the more times a child is exposed to adversity, the greater their risk is of developing a serious mental health problem. And that's exactly what this graph shows you here. So any number above 1 indicates elevated risk, but as you can see, as the number of adversity exposures goes up and up and up, so too does the risk of severe impairment due to mental health disorders. So as scientists, as citizens, as policymakers, as parents, we really need to think seriously about how to reduce adversity exposure for youth in our community, with immigrant youth representing one of our potentially most vulnerable populations. And also for those who have been exposed to adversity, how can we build resilience? So why is adversity potentially so problematic for children? Well, one reason is a bit of a quirk in a feature of child development. So if you look at some of our mammalian relatives, they're quite different from us in a variety of ways. But one way in which they're different is that they grow up a lot faster. So if you take, for example, the mouse here, they reach adulthood in about 2 to 3 months. Seems speedy, on point. Human children, by contrast, take about 2 to 3 decades. So are we just really bad at this? Is this a huge design flaw? I asked these questions myself this morning, trying to get my kids out the door to daycare while also getting to the airport. It's not a design flaw. It actually has tremendous benefit to us as a species. It is because we take so luxuriously long to get ready to be an adult that we are so smart and so adaptable as a species. The human brain takes about 20 to 25 years to finish developing, and it's not sitting idle in that time. It's learning as much as it can about the environment. It's trying to figure out, what language am I going to speak? How do I solve problems? How do I learn to regulate my emotions? How do I navigate a subway system if I live in a city? How do I grow crops if I live in an agrarian environment? There's all kinds of skills we humans can learn, and we're only going to learn them through experience. Mice come more or less pre-programmed by contrast to humans. We need to be really adaptive. So this has many benefits, this long, slow developmental process. It allows us to learn much, but it also makes us incredibly sensitive to our environment. And that's part of what builds this sensitivity to adversity. Moreover, this long development means that children have a longer period of time in which adversity can be impactful on them. It also has a second implication, which is that caregiving is essential for human development. If you think about it, we can't be vulnerable and incapable of taking care of ourselves for 2 to 3 decades unless someone else is going to take care of us. And over the course of evolution, human children have developed a very strong internal biological alarm system that goes off when their parents are taken from them forcibly or when they're separated for prolonged periods of time. And for this reason, it's vital to children's ability to cope with stress and challenge and adversity to have their parents nearby them. And so this has particular implications for the two kinds of adversity that I'm going to focus on the next slide: family separation and institutional care. So these are two forms of adversity that have gotten a lot of attention in the last couple of years, particularly in the context of understanding immigrant youth in the United States. And while many policies are changing to try to reduce the likelihood of family separation and institutional care, they remain ongoing concerns, particularly for children who have already been separated from their parents and for those who risk being separated due to deportation. While we don't know as much as I would like about the long-term implications of these two adversities for immigrant youth in the United States, we do know quite a bit from other points in history in other parts of the world about what the potential implications of these kinds of adversity exposure are. So first, I want to mention the Helsinki Birth Cohort Study. This was a study of 13,000 Finnish children who were born during the years of 1934 to 1944. And this wasn't obviously a planned part of the study, but over the course of the study, World War II happened. And during this time, some children participated in a voluntary program where their parents placed them abroad, thinking that they would be out of harm's way in the event that war came closer to Finland. Unfortunately, this had an unintended consequence. where over time these children were followed and their health was tracked. And it turns out that decades later, if you look at children who were placed temporarily away from their parents, even for just a short period of time, you see this increased risk of severe mental illness, cardiovascular disease, and diabetes, speaking to the long-term consequences of even relatively brief separations from one's parent. A second study that I want to mention is the Bucharest Early Intervention Project, which took place in the backdrop of communist Romania, where you see that a combination of coercive pro-natalist policies and also limited options for foster care resulted in a number of children being placed in institutional orphanage settings. In 2000, a number of American researchers together with European researchers came together to try to set up a pilot study of foster care to see what would happen to children who had been in institutional orphanage settings, where some of them stayed in orphanage settings and some were placed in this pilot foster care program. The results revealed that having any exposure to institutional care harms cognitive, emotional, and physical development, speaking to the need for caregiving in children and to have consistent caregiving from a parent or a parent-like individual. But they also revealed the capacity for resilience in children who have been exposed to adversity, such that those who were placed in high-quality foster care environments seem to show quite a bit of recovery as opposed to those who stayed in the institutional orphanage care over time. So again, I just want to emphasize that this really illustrates the power of resilience in adversity-exposed youth when placed in really positive contexts. So the reason that adversity has such a strong impact on developing children is in part because of the changes that it creates in the arc of their patterns of brain development. And while adversity doesn't impact all parts of the brain, it seems to have, really pack a strong punch for parts that are responsible for processing emotion. So I'm going to talk just briefly about two brain regions. This is the extent of the neuroscience I'm going to throw at you today. But the first I want to mention is a structure called the amygdala, which is really important for identifying and remembering threats. So if you're in an argument with someone and they're threatening you and you're feeling somewhat scared, your amygdala is helping to alert the rest of your brain to this potential for danger. The amygdala is very early developing. It comes online pretty early on in childhood. Now, by contrast to the amygdala, is the prefrontal cortex. It's actually a much larger brain region than what I've circled here. That's just a portion of it. The prefrontal cortex is very slow developing and is important for supporting language and your ability to make good decisions. It's also important for regulating emotional responses to different kinds of threats in the environment. So the prefrontal cortex has the ability to quiet the amygdala down and to allow you to kind of manage emotional responses to threats in the environment. A number of studies have compared children who are exposed to adversity to children who have not, to see how these two brain systems are impacted by adversity. I'm going to focus just in the next couple slides on children who experienced institutional care, but you see somewhat similar findings to children who have experienced abuse, neglect, and other kinds of adversity. The first thing that you see happen in children who've experienced adversity are changes in the size of the amygdala such that it becomes larger as a function of adversity exposure. You also see the amygdala become more reactive to threats. And importantly, what I'm showing you here on the right-hand graph is not just a general increase in amygdala activity, but that those children who experience adversity, who show particularly pronounced amygdala responses to threats, have higher anxiety levels, really illustrating the link between adversity impacting the brain and the brain predicting mental health. When we look at the prefrontal cortex, a very different set of findings emerge. Specifically, adversity exposure seems to cause thinning in the prefrontal cortex, really reducing its integrity. And while there's been less work looking at the effects of institutional care on prefrontal activity and its function, in my lab and others, we have some initial data suggesting that it inhibits activity and function in the prefrontal cortex, which may directly impair a child's ability to regulate their emotions, or make it more difficult at least. So together, these two sets of changes suggest that institutionalization and other forms of adversity cause the brain to become more vigilant to threats in the environment and may make it harder to regulate emotion. In the short term, this makes a lot of sense. If you're growing up in an environment where you don't have your parents around or you don't have a degree of safety, it behooves you to be paying attention, to be scanning to see if there's some danger lurking on the horizon. That's what's going to keep you alive. But in the long run, it may have significant costs to one's mental and physical health. So, thus far, I've been talking a lot about some of the potential dangers of childhood adversity. I want to conclude today by talking about how we can cultivate resilience in immigrant youth. The first thing that I'm going to say is probably not shocking because I've been kind of hitting home over and over again the importance of parents. It is critical that we keep children with their parents to the extent possible because parents can promote health on so many levels. And I want to illustrate one finding that I think really nicely demonstrates this point. So as I've been talking about the amygdala, this is a brain center that's important for identifying and remembering threats. Parents seem to have this kind of opposing influence on amygdala activity to threats in the environment. So here I'm showing you brain activity in the amygdala for children who never experienced institutional care and children who did. Children who never experienced institutional care, you see this reduction in amygdala activity just looking at pictures of their parents. Their parents aren't even in the room with them, just looking at them and thinking about them. Children who experienced institutional care do not show this effect on average, but some do. And it turns out that those kids who do show a reduction in the amygdala response after experiencing this really intense form of adversity go on to have lower anxiety levels over time, suggesting that parents can be a vital source of resilience for kids who have experienced adversity and can help them to really achieve greater mental health over time. When parents are not an option because they are deceased, because they are abusive, because they have been separated from their children, there are other second-tier options that may provide quality and consistent caregiving. So here I'm showing you the results from the Bucharest Early Intervention Project I reported on earlier. All the way on the left, you see anxiety and depression levels for children who were in institutional care and stayed there over time. All the way on the right are children who never experienced orphanage care, and you can see they report much lower levels of anxiety and depression. What's really interesting is the children in purple, so second from the right, they show nearly identical levels of anxiety and depression to children who never experienced institutional care. And those are kids who were placed in high-quality foster care settings, where they stayed with one parent over time and were able to develop a sense of security and to really attach with their foster parents. By comparison, those kids in pink were the ones who had multiple foster care placements where they were getting moved around a lot and failed to achieve that kind of stability. Really showing that if we can create a safe and stable environment for kids after adversity exposure where caregiving is supported, there is tremendous potential for resilience. But if we don't, you see this sort of perpetuation of the negative consequences of adversity. The last data point I'm going to show you illustrates the need to teach kids and their parents who may also have experienced adversity in the context of immigrant youth and families coping skills that can help them to deal with some of the stress they've experienced. And I'm not saying to do this instead of satisfying basic needs like providing food, shelter, education, employment opportunities, but in addition to. So this is from a study looking at adults who had a history of foster care as children. And what you see is that while on average adults who experience foster care as children report difficulties with anxiety, that's what higher numbers here mean, those who also have strong coping skills or emotion regulation skills show much lower anxiety levels than youth who have a history of foster care who do not possess these skills. And there are loads of easy to implement pretty brief interventions that can be performed as well as more substantial ones that are likely to improve coping skills for families who have experienced adversity. It's also going to be imperative that we train teachers, pediatricians, and other providers in trauma-informed care and to really educate folks about the prevalence of adversity exposure in immigrant youth. And finally, I just want to make a plug for the need to support more research in immigrant youth. There's very little known about the long-term consequences of some of the kinds of adversity that our immigrant youth in this country are experiencing. Dr. Deerdorf is going to be talking about some of this really amazing and rare research that she's been performing that's so valuable to this cause, and we really need more. So I just want to conclude by saying thank you for your attention and also to note my gratitude to the Immigrant Youth Task Force at UCLA, for which I'm a founding member, and also my lab at UCLA. Thank you.
I didn't mention mentioned at the beginning, in the interest of making sure that the speakers are all able to share their information with you, we're going to save our Q&A for the end. So I'm going to ask Dr. Deerdorf to come up to give us her talk on the effects of adversity in immigration policy on U.S.-born Mexican-American youth.
Thank you. So thank you so much for having me here today. I would like to talk about some of our research in Salinas, which focuses on adversity and immigration policy and how they're affecting youth. And I want to point out that we're going to be talking about U.S.-born Mexican-American youth today. So I and many of my colleagues take what we call a life course approach to adolescent health. And that means we basically think about, and great introduction by Dr. Silvers, because she did all the hard work of saying how stress gets under the skin and how it happens over time. But we take a developmental perspective and look at how health unfolds over the life course, even starting in utero, to shape current health in adolescence and also health over time into adulthood. And we're interested both in positive and negative events early in life that will impact a developing adolescent. Now, many of you have heard about adverse childhood experience, I would guess, especially here near Sacramento. However, what many people don't know is, while it's received a lot of attention recently, these studies on what we call ACEs started in the mid-1990s, so about 25 years ago now, when Vince Felitti from Kaiser Permanente and Bob Anda from CDC interviewed about 17,000 adults in Kaiser in Southern California to ask them about their early life experiences that happened between 0 and 18 years old. So they really were looking at adult health, but going way back in time to find out what was going on in their early childhoods and into their teenage years. And these were some of the things that they asked about. They wanted to know whether between 0 and 18 years old, some of these adults had experienced physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, neglect. Had they been living with a parent with a mental health issue, grown up with somebody with substance use issue, parental incarceration, which gets back to the separation issues, parental separation or divorce, incarceration, divorce, separation, and domestic violence, among many, many others. And because they were Kaiser, they had well-documented health records of what these adults had experienced in terms of their health over time and their mental health. I think what was most surprising to these researchers back then was that these ACEs experiences were not rare. They were actually quite common among their population. Now remember, this is a predominantly white population who's insured, and yet 2/3 of them had experienced at least one adverse event, which is really high. 1 in 8 of these folks had experienced at least 4 or more events. And so if you remember back to the slide that Dr. Silvers showed, where it's kind of a dose-response situation, where if you have 4 or 5 events, you're really at high risk for a poor health outcome, then 4 or more is you're getting into the high range. And as you told us, the more ACEs, the more poor health outcomes these folks were experiencing. Now, there's been a lot of research over the years, over those 25 years, and folks have looked at all different kinds of health outcomes experienced in adulthood. And so here's just a few of the health outcomes we're talking about. So cardiovascular risk, heart attacks, lung disease, lung cancer, sexual and reproductive health outcomes are affected by early life events. Not surprisingly, depression, anxiety, and also life expectancy. So there's actually been some research showing that these adults who experienced a large number of life events from 0 to 18 had up to a 20-year difference in their life expectancy. You probably recognize this woman. She's our first state Surgeon General, Nadine Burke-Harris, appointed to California. And she has spent much of her career examining toxic stress and childhood effects of early adversity and health on children. And her goal was really to take this research out of the realm of adult health outcomes and start paying attention to what was happening in childhood to kids. And so she was really affected by the fact that she was running a clinic in Bayview Hunters Point that was opened by CPMC, and she was getting child after child reporting with ADHD and respiratory issues, asthma, and a variety of health effects and mental health situations, and she thought, this can't be right. This is much higher than the prevalence that we see in other communities. And as you know, the Bayview is a community that where youth are facing a lot of adversity. And she said, we have to get to the bottom of this, because I'm seeing this ACEs research that came out of this study in Kaiser, and if we don't do something about this now, we're going to have these intractable adult health outcomes that are really hard to reverse. The ship is hard to turn at that point in time. So in her clinic, she started doing these intensive kind of interventions that are really not common in pediatric settings, but that involved the community, and got caseworkers on board, and provided mental health services and social workers and healthcare to help these youth. And that was really a pivotal point in time, because she didn't just stay in the clinic, as you know. She then came and started speaking out about these issues and making them more mainstream. And up until that point, even though all this work had been done in Kaiser before, there wasn't a whole lot of screening going on in pediatric clinics that were in areas of adversity, because people didn't know, they didn't have the resources, and they didn't know what to do with these situations if they were to screen for these adverse circumstances. So she kind of set a model that it was possible, even in the pediatric setting, to intervene early and start to try to change the course of these events. Now, one area that has been seriously neglected and that we've been focusing on is, what are the stressors, though, that are specific to Latino families, Latinx families in the United States, and particularly in California? Because, sure, we talk a lot about these really extreme events, and they're happening to all families at some level. But we don't talk about the things that are chronic and pervasive and could cause what we call a weathering effect that can really damage people's health over time. And some of the ones that we have been focusing on are up here. There's the stress of acculturation, learning another language, having to adapt your cultural norms in order to work in certain settings or get a job, discrimination, which can be everything from very explicit discrimination to kind of the microaggressions that happen day in, day out that people have to bear the body burden of, and it shows up in inflammatory processes when you look at folks and how things get under the skin, that these small things, seemingly small things, actually take a toll over time. Also, people who have immigrated have to navigate institutions, and they're institutions that they're not familiar with limited language, like medical, school for their kids, social services. And this is not to mention what's been becoming increasingly negative, which is the immigration policy and the rhetoric surrounding it right now, especially at the federal level. And I think we really haven't paid, on campuses at UC, it's really interesting. We hear stories all the time of fear of deportation. And we have students who are undocumented, and their families are, family members are as well. And so we're bearing this educational responsibility with youth who come to our offices and talk a lot about fear of deportation for either their self or loved ones all the time. But it has not been given a lot of attention in the research literature. And so that was one of our inspirations for doing this work. Youth have very specific issues that they face as they're developing that can convey adverse circumstances. So youth in general are changing a lot. It's a very active developmental time. They're trying to navigate social settings. They're trying to manage their conflict with their parents and rules and trying to find autonomy and individuation. But U.S.-born Mexican origin youth often are also dealing with these generational gaps with their parents, where they may have differences in cultural norms. They're trying to figure out to what end they want to acculturate, or they can enculturate and take on their parents' cultural values. There's some sense of obligation and burden that can come with that. There's also a lot of resilience that can be found in that. But it's a time where there can be challenges within the family, which can result in some family conflict as well. Also, from very young ages, many of our U.S.-born Mexican origin youth are doing language brokering. So do folks know what language brokering is in here? You're basically helping your parents navigate these complex settings by being their primary translator. And that can be very burdensome for youth who are also trying to get their homework done and go to school. And a lot of times it's way above their pay grade. They're too young to be trying to navigate these settings and forms and conversations with adults to advocate for their parents. You can imagine how that would be a source of extreme stress. So 20 years ago, my colleague Brenda Eskenazi started a study in Salinas, California, and it's called Chamacos, the Center for Health Assessment of Mothers and Children of Salinas. And her goal with this study was to really understand how families living in agricultural areas were being exposed to pesticides and other chemicals, how those were getting under the skin and affecting the neurodevelopment of developing fetuses. So she focused on women during pregnancy, and then she wanted to follow those babies up to see whether the pesticides were affecting their neurocognitive development and eventually how they did in school and socially. And so we took advantage of this opportunity to take a look at these youth as they grew up over time, to not just look at pesticide and chemical exposure, but also to look at the adversities that they were experiencing. So I'll tell you a little bit about that. So this study started about 20 years ago, between 1999 and 2000, when I say we, but I came on much later, where Brenda and her team recruited over 600 pregnant women. Of these women, 92% spoke Spanish, 85% were born in Mexico. More than half had lived in the United States less than 5 years when they were pregnant and gave birth in the study. 96% were living in poverty. The clinics were prenatal clinics that they recruited from that served Medicare and women of a certain poverty limit. So that was intentional. And almost half had sixth grade education or less and worked in agriculture. But the vast majority had someone working in agriculture living in their home. So in terms of chemical exposure, people bring chemicals into the home, pesticides into the home when they work in the fields. This gives you an idea of the timeline of the study. So for 20 years, we followed these youth. We're now in the 18-year visit. And it also gives you an idea of the number of times we brought them into the clinic and assessed them and their parents. So at pregnancy, there were 2 visits, and then birth, 6 months, 1 year, and so on. And we have great data now in adolescence because the kids are older, from 12, 14, 16, and now 18 years that we're gathering as they move into emerging adulthood and are starting to leave high school. We have so many types of assessments. I only show you this slide so you can understand the vastness of this study, and I won't be speaking to much of these data, but it exists. We've interviewed the moms and the teachers when the kids were young. We tested the children. We asked them about emotional and kind of behavioral health. We determined when they entered puberty by physical exam. We've measured their height and weight. We've evaluated their respiratory function. We've asked them now about their mental and emotional health and also their behaviors. Oh, and we also have a vast number of biospecimens. So we've collected breast milk, urine, saliva, blood, and other data over time. What I'm not going to talk to you about today, but it's a really important part of the project, is it has a whole community-based participatory action piece where we actually went into the community in advance and brought everyone to the table, the teachers, the growers, the farm worker representatives, and the key leaders in the community before the study was even launched. And we followed along with a lot of community education and responsiveness and brought Salinas individuals and youth to come work on the project and be part of it. So it's a collaborative project. We're not just taking data, we stay in the community. Okay, and here's some of the data on adversity. So not surprisingly, from age 0 to 5, almost half of the youth had experienced at least one stressful event. Now, these aren't the ACEs I was discussing before. This is a list of childhood stressful events it comes from a different source that includes more events. But 60% had ever had a mother with depression during ages 0 to 5. 64% only had Spanish spoken in the home. That's not necessarily an adversity. It's actually rich to grow up bilingual, but it does show that many of these youth might have been language brokering for their parents if they were monolingual Spanish speakers. 13% had had a parent who died, and 8% had a parent who was jailed during that time. And that was just from 0 to 5. And so you can kind of see in the childhood events, stressful life events scale, just a large number of youth had 4 or more stressful events happen to them. And now, what about adolescence? Well, right as our youth were turning 16 years old, we were ushering in a new administration at the federal level. And as you know, negative rhetoric about immigrants started early in the presidential election campaign, and it just didn't stop. There was an increase in ICE raids, even in California, which is a sanctuary state. There were challenges to DACA. We dealt with a lot of it on our campuses when we talked about with our dreamers and their fears. And family separation, as Dr. Silvers mentioned, was highly publicized in the media. So needless to say, we had a very stressed out cohort of people. So we had been following these families for this many years, thank you. And we were worried they weren't going to come back in. And it turned out it was the opposite. We were the one group they trusted, and then they came to us for referrals to places where they felt they could go that were safe to get legal representation or to get medical care or to have their needs met. So thank God NIH kept funding us because we got to keep staying in the community and provide service. So we ended up being service provision as well, which wasn't really what we were there for, but we made it happen. And then we also were able to capitalize on this kind of inflection point in time where adversity increased so much for these youth by asking some immigration policy related questions. And so we asked the 16-year-olds questions like, in the past 3 months, did you fear that you or your family member would be reported to immigration officials? Or did you worry that about family separation due to deportation? We asked about their friends, about their own safety. And I want you to keep in mind, these are US-born youth. These are U.S. citizens, right? And yet 21% had very high immigration policy-related concerns. And I point that out because that's the group we were really interested in, the ones that were really highly stressed and anxious because of this. And yet almost 50% reported some concern about immigration policy in terms of their family, in terms of family separation, and in terms of family members being reported to immigration officials. And I just put this up here. It's not part of the scale, but 38% of the mothers were depressed at that cross point in time. So that's very high. What did immigration policy concerns relate to? Well, not surprisingly, the youth who had higher concerns had worse sleep. They had higher anxiety. And we know these issues can affect school performance, absenteeism. It can affect how you cognitively process. It can affect driving in terms of accidents and also your relationship with your peers. And we also saw a trend, but it wasn't significant, towards depressive symptomatology, depressive symptoms in these youth. I didn't want to leave out the moms, so I'm going to show you this quickly. We also asked the moms about their fears of deportation of friends and family members when the kids were young. We don't ask them about their citizenship, and we don't ask them about specifically themselves for obvious reasons, but we say friends and family or yourself kind of thing. The concerns were high in terms of deportation worry. Overall, we saw that half the moms had a lot of worry, followed by about 25% of the moms having moderate worry, and that's overall. So most of them were worrying, period. And then if you look among the immigrant moms, the ones that we know gave birth, we don't know their citizenship again, but we know they immigrated. You can see how high that worry goes up, and that's in that middle section. In the blue and the green bars, that's a lot of worry. Oops, it's doing it on its own. A lot of worry and moderate worry. And with the moms, we found that was related to blood pressure. So the ones who are moderately and in the higher worry categories were having much higher systolic blood pressure, which in combination with the fact that this is a sample that's overweight and obese in large percentages really increases the risk for cardiovascular problems in this sample. And I want to say, because we always think of overweight and obesity as being some individual factor that drives it, it was also related to the immigration and deportation concerns. So the good news is family's protective. We're doing some work right now with the adolescent data, and we've found that even though early life adversity affects risk-taking behaviors among our youth, like engaging in alcohol use, marijuana use early, and sexual initiation, family matters. It's buffering those effects. It's protecting those kids from effects. We're next going to start looking at cultural values and cultural norms that the youth have embraced that may also be protective. So that's future directions for this work. So there is a positive story here as well. But what's next? And I don't mean to knock your last slides, Jen, but as clinicians, we really try to intervene clinically. You know, mental health professionals teach kids and their parents better coping, to emotionally regulate, to manage their anxiety, but it doesn't get at the core problem, which is contending with this environment of fear, this culture of fear that we're creating that singles you or your family out. And it's especially important to consider this adversity when it involves policies that threaten family separation and in the midst of all this harsh and discriminatory rhetoric. So that's why we're here. This is why I got out of my comfort zone, which is as a researcher to talk to you, because I really feel like at the state level we have made a difference, and we can make even more of a difference. And if things don't change at the federal policy level, it has to happen here. So here are some of the areas that we've really helped in and that we can do more in, and I'm sure there's more that you know of that I don't. So I want to thank you. I also want to thank Brenda Eskenazi for thinking 20 years ago to ask about adversity when her study was about chemicals. And also our team and our funders and our families that have stayed with us this whole time. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Julie. For our third talk today, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Jana Juvonen from UCLA, who's going to be speaking on immigrant youth in schools, how to foster a sense of safety and belonging.
Thank you, Paul, and I hope, do you want to do a little stretch or get some little refreshments? So I hope you can bear with me a little bit longer. So far what we've heard about is the role of parents and role of families, and now I'm going to bring you to schools. So I study social emotional development and really try to understand how schools, just like parents and families, can support kids regarding that. So schools is a really good place for us to think about in terms of their role for immigrant youth, because as you all know, school-aged children are, they go to school. They are entitled to schooling, not only in California, but in the country. So the issue really, when you sort of think about societally about schools and their function, is that schools can potentially serve a very critical role in here when we talk about immigrant youth in helping with integration, societal integration. And so what I want to do today is to really critically analyze the school's role in facilitating integration of immigrant youth to our society, but moreover to the question of our schools being sensitive to the needs of immigrant youth. And what I should say here is I'm really extrapolating here, drawing from large bodies of literature, and they are not necessarily all on the kind of the immigrant population that we're thinking about right now in California. But as you can sort of see, there are really good connections that we can talk about. So when we think about kids, immigrant kids in school, most of the time schools focus on the following needs. First and foremost, their language. So the lack of English proficiency is really important educationally to think about for schools and how to help them learn English language. Some schools are concerned about, they're quite aware of the mental health needs and their also physical health needs and have, for example, nutrition programs. And these are all really important issues that schools indeed need to consider. But these are kind of the unique needs that pertain specifically to immigrant students. And what I'm arguing here today is that it's equally important not to forget the sort of basic developmental needs of kids. When we talk about immigrant youth, we're talking about kids and teens. So, what's important for kids and teens? Like we've heard today, it's really critical for all children and teens to feel safe. Safe in order to develop trusting relationships. It's very important for them to feel supported, so that the support helps them deal with the distress they encounter. And a basic human need, and especially pertinent when we're talking about school-age children, is also sense of belonging. And sense of belonging or lack of sense of belonging has been shown to adversely affect health and psychological well-being. So let's now think about, our schools helping immigrant youth with these basic developmental needs? When we actually know that immigrant youth are doing more poorly regarding feeling safe and connected in school compared to US-born kids. So what we know is that they are more likely to experience social exclusion, feel more socially isolated, and are more likely to be verbally and physically attacked. And the reasons why they attacked have to do because of their race, religion, lack of English proficiency, or socioeconomic status. Moreover, when we talk about immigrant students, they are least likely to report these incidents, and often the reasons have to do with their fears of the ramifications of them reporting getting mistreated in school. And of course, for the group that we're most concerned about in California right now, issues of deportation is one critical element of this. So, in terms of how immigrant students get treated in school, by their peers poorly. So while it's kind of easy for us to understand why kids who get bullied and targeted specifically by their peers might feel distressed, what about social isolation? Well, when we think about isolation in the context of schooling, basically what we are talking about a kid who's eating lunch alone, who doesn't have friends, nobody to hang out with. So basically we are talking about friendless youth. In our large longitudinal study that my colleague Sandra Graham and I have been conducting for the past 8 years, we've followed 6,000 students in 26. Initially, they started in 26 ethnically diverse California public middle schools, and one of the questions that one of my students and I were curious about is that how does this feeling of being socially disconnected or isolated, specifically not having any friends, would that really affect some of the mental health issues that have been documented for bullying? And basically, this kind of a messy looking graph, what it simply shows is that those kids who were friendless at 6th grade developed increasing levels of internalizing problems, that is, increasing levels of depression, social anxiety, and low self-esteem when they felt threatened, when they felt that they couldn't trust the peers around them, when they felt that they were targeted by their peers, where they felt that the school was unsafe, and where they estimated a greater number of their peers to be engaging in negative behaviors. So, and in all of this, we were controlling for ethnic differences, for gender differences, all kinds of prior levels of internalizing problem. So this study is not about immigrant youth, but I think shows you some of the underlying processes. Something as benign as not having friends in and of itself is bad for kids. But moreover, there are many studies on immigrant kids in particular showing that they are at greater risk for getting bullied at school. Here's one example, a large, well-known study on health behavior of school-aged children. This was the US-based sample where 1,000 of the kids were not US-born. And it was in this sample, particularly the Latinx immigrant youth, and particularly males who were most likely to get bullied. Moreover, what the study showed that these bullied immigrant youth reported more health problems and more substance abuse problems compared to their non-bullied peers. So greater distress as a function of either isolation or bullying, and also greater health problems. So the question is, can schools protect immigrant students from these negative consequences? Well, we've certainly made progress in teaching about cultural sensitivity in our schools. We have made great progress in, for example, having schools use some sort of anti-bullying program. And in spite of all these significant measures of progress, there are still teachers and other school staff who feel particularly unprepared to intervene, for example, in bullying situations when it involves a newcomer student, an immigrant student. Moreover, teachers demonstrate biases, their prejudice, in more subtle ways. One is that they still continue to often punish or reprimand students if they are using their native language, and sometimes calling students by their Americanized names and not using their actual names. So it's not only peers who show biases and negative treatment, but also some of the teachers unintentionally are engaging in behaviors that do not help kids feel safe or supported. So there's no question that teachers lack still training, and they very much need more training. But there's more to the story. So there are actually in our schools still instructional practices that further marginalize immigrant youth. And a case in point is English language learning programs. Again, there's really good reasons to have English language program instruction for immigrant youth, but the way they operate is problematic. How? The English language programs are typically segregated classrooms. So the English learners are separating from the other kids to receive this education, which essentially not only separates them from their English-speaking peers, but also hinders their acculturation into the society. This lack of contact between the groups, the immigrant youth and the others, certainly promotes this stereotype. Often these classrooms, the English language learning classrooms are referred to as the Mexican classrooms in California and Arizona, where we have a huge Mexican immigrant population. And these are the reasons why, indeed, the kids show the prejudice toward their peers. And moreover, these programs, you would think that, English language learning is something that is relatively short-lived. Kids don't stay in these classrooms, but the evidence shows the contrary. That is, kids tend to stay in these classrooms over long periods of time, and as such, basically, it functions like academic tracking. They are tracked on the lower track with lower expectations, and then in high school, they don't have access to, for example, the college preparatory classes. So we certainly could be thinking about this in other ways. So even something as simple as language learning, how could it take place? So what I'm proposing here is that, what about if we really started thinking about immigrant youth as kids? kids with the same needs as everybody else, except that in this case, maybe some of these needs, like need for safety, support, and sense of belonging, are heightened because everything that we've already heard. So what about if we started with this question of first how to think about how to facilitate the sense of safety and belonging. And if we did this, it might be that we are actually better off ameliorating some of their other issues, for example, the mental health. So how could we possibly think about promoting sense of safety in school for immigrant youth and others? The large longitudinal study that Dr. Graham and I have conducted over the years, there, again, the focus was not on immigrant youth, but we have a very robust set of findings regarding what promotes sense of safety across all ethnic groups. And what we find is it's not greater numbers of similar others, like we typically think, but it is greater diversity. So when kids attend schools that are ethnically diverse and classrooms that are diverse, so not segregating kids into those who can and those who cannot, but mixing them in multiple ways at the level of classrooms and schools, that's when they are feeling safer. They feel safer in school, they are less likely to report getting bullied, and they feel less lonely. And what we think is going on is in these kind of heterogeneous settings, what happens is there's a better balance of power. It's not that some are higher in status and others lower. We are not dividing kids, but we're actually bringing the kids together, and they can form these important cross-group contacts. So lately we've been thinking about, my students and I, about what it makes diversity work. We hear so much on our college campuses and everywhere in the public school system also about this notion about diversity and exclusion and inclusion. And it sort of promotes this notion that as long as something is diverse, it means that everybody is included. And that's far from the case, right? So what we really need to know is that when we have diversity available to us, in this case, the immigrant youth are part of the diversity. So what we need to be thinking about is the strategies, how we can increase this cross-group contact. What it means for the school is simple things like monitoring the representation of the classrooms, that they reflect the diversity of the school that it has. Kids are very sensitive to attending classrooms where it does not reflect the whole community. Making sure that everybody has access to certain type of classes once the kids are in secondary school. Teaching teachers to use strategies that promote interaction and contact. For example, one really proven, really powerful way is for kids to cooperate. So teachers using cooperative learning, which they rarely do in secondary schools anymore. So that's when the kids share a common goal, they come together, and that is important. Then we can talk about inclusion. And the best medicine for reducing prejudice is friendships. Once you get to know a kid who's unlike you, you're going to change your views about their group. Very potent ingredient. Moreover, what we know about research on immigrant youth in particular is that when they are able to form friendships with different race, US-born peers, that enhances their level of acculturation, whereas their friendships with same race, second and third generation peers can foster better enculturation. That is, taking pride in their culture, retaining their language, And we know that if we're really trying to promote health and well-being among immigrant youth, it's not only how we're going to get them to be like us, but to take pride in their culture and really, for example, language-wise, remain bilingual, not become only a proficient in English. So, if we really go back to the issue of schools are great places to promote societal integration, we have to recognize this is a two-way process. So it entails for us to have positive attitudes toward immigrant youth. And we also have to think about what are the experiences that allow the immigrant youth to develop positive attitudes toward the new culture. And if they get bullied, if they are isolated, if they get sort of sense that the teachers are prejudiced and not supportive of them, this is certainly not the place to be. So what we need to be thinking about more, from my perspective, is that schools need to be resources to provide that support for immigrant, especially newcomer students, in multiple ways. So really thinking about, first and foremost, about creating trusting and diverse relationships while helping maintain their ties to their heritage culture. So we can really start thinking about reconceptualizing schools as safe havens, as sanctuaries, when we start thinking about their basic needs first, before we just think about the issues of language and other special needs. And we have examples of this already. So, for example, in Los Angeles, we have the UCLA Community School that recognizes the cultural richness of its students, largely immigrant population in the heart of LA. They rely on inclusive practices for bilingual, not English language learning, but bilingual education. They use inclusive models also to serve the special needs of their students. This is an unbelievable campus close to downtown that also now provides legal services for their families. They just opened up a legal clinic on their campus. And it engages their students, especially now at the secondary level, in becoming people who can fight for their own rights. For example, they have training sessions for the students for letting them know their rights. So again, we're talking about heart of LA, where the ICE agents are plenty and around, where their parents may be working right outside of the school, for example, selling tamales and whatnot, where the whole school community feels easily threatened by any immigrant raids. So, to end on a positive note, I know we have probably brought you down rather than up with all our talks, so I think that it's also time to think about California as a special case and to think about how California can lead the way. So, one place where we can definitely start is with schools. Schools supporting immigrant youth. So what do we need? We need teachers to get further training on culturally sensitive practices, but moreover to really start thinking about the instructional methods and policies and practices that we have in schools that are segregating, separating, and isolating immigrant youth. We can definitely do much more, and we should be doing much more experimenting on new approaches specifically that are targeting these normative developmental needs of newcomer students. And as has been pitched already before, we definitely need more research on this topic. That is, we need to be studying the effects and effectiveness of our new and old practices in school. But moreover, we need longitudinal data. This is a vulnerable population who we have as newcomer kids in our schools right now. And we need to be able to be supported to get the data, the kind of longitudinal data that you've heard about today. So again, thank you so much for being such good audience today. And I want to recognize here a graduate student of mine, doctoral student Ritika Rastogi, who's been helping me with the lit review here, the Adolescent Consortium that Paul is here representing and leading, and also the Immigrant Youth Task Force at UCLA that Jen Silvers and I are part of. So thank you.